Chapter 18. Lacey waited out of sight in the woods, watching to make sure Dusty and his girlfriend returned to the cabin. She watched as her son debated defying her, but eventually gave in and started the long trek back to the cabin. Dusty meant well. He had always meant well, but some things were beyond his capacity. He wasn't a killer. It wasn't his fault, and if Lacey was honest with herself, she was glad he wasn't like that. He was better than she was, wiser, kinder, and got along better with people. Lacey was actually relieved he had listened. The way he was looking at her, she wasn't sure if he would actually do it or not. He had never been that defiant, not even in the throes of his teenage angst. She suspected the girl might have something to do with his new attitude. Lacey remained in the woods for a bit longer, conflicted about her next moves. She had done what she needed, getting the other forest rangers out of harm's way, along with the tourists who were visiting. But if what Dusty said was true, then she could still be in danger. There was no reason those terrorists wouldn't point those missiles at the town of Big Rock and hold them hostage. And her daughter's words about acting to do something were weighing on her as well. Lacey wasn't Rambo. If she chose to fight them, she wouldn't be able to do it alone. But with few allies in town, she wasn't sure who she could call on to help. "This isn't my problem," Lacey said, and then she turned to head home. But there was a gust of wind behind her, and on the breeze, she could have sworn that she heard Sean's voice and a single word. "Help." Lacey stopped, closing her eyes. It was all in her head. She knew that. She often heard Sean's voice when she was alone in the woods, but the harder she tried to return to the cabin, the more her body slowed. Katie was right. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. The last thing Lacey wanted was to return to town and beg for help, but she believed that once people understood the threat they were facing, and what was sitting in their backyard, they would jump to act. At least, that was what she hoped they would do. It was always tough to figure out what exactly someone was thinking. The town might have hated Lacey. They might have thought she was a murderer. Today's events revealed to her that she had no hesitation to kill to defend herself. But as much as the townspeople hated Lacey or thought she was a monster who lived in the woods, she knew they didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who wreaked havoc on the town. But there were two individuals Lacey had in mind to recruit for the fight. She wanted to enlist Baker and Fisher, the two Marines from earlier. She'd seen them fight, and they handled themselves well. This was a fight that required a more violent approach. And if Lacey wanted to succeed, then she would need people who knew how to be violent. They had enjoyed taking out the terrorists, and it was as though they had been waiting for a mission, something to sink their teeth into, and Lacey had another one for them. Once she reached Big Rock, Lacey made a beeline for the sheriff's office, and she found Tommy in the middle of a heated debate.
"Sheriff, we need to establish communications with the capital," Deputy Milton said. "I can take one of my cousin's horses and return before nightfall.
"I don't want us splitting up," Tommy said. And then he noticed Lacey enter the building.
"Lacey?"
Lacey ignored Tommy and immediately went to Del Baker and Winston Fisher, who sat in the corner of the office, looking bored. "I need you to," Lacey said. "There are some more terrorists up on the mountain. We're going to stop them." It was all the explanation Baker and Fisher needed as they gathered their gear and stood up.
"We need to reload,"
Fisher said, checking his stocks.
"Yeah, we'll be done in 5,
Baker said. "All right," Lacey said. The men walked over to the locker room where the ammunitions were stored. Lacey also noted that Tommy and the deputies had been smart enough to steal the weapons and ammunition from the dead terrorists. Tommy walked over to Lacey while the rest of his deputies kept distance.
"What's going on?"
"I'm dealing with a problem," Lacey said.
"Yeah, Billy told me about the terrorists,"
Tommy said.
"He said they had computers."
"That's right," Lacey said. "And missiles." Tommy waited for more, but when Lacey didn't provide anything else, he stepped closer.
"And you're planning on doing what exactly?"
"Stopping them from hurting anyone else," Lacey said. You're more than welcome to join.
Lacey, I don't think going up there and provoking those men is a good idea, Tommy said. We just ran them out of town. We don't need to paint a target on our backs.
I don't need a lecture from you, Lacey said. You were elected to protect the town. I'm charged with the protection of the forest. I'm not taking any of your guys. Not that they'd come with me anyway. I'm not here to step on toes.
This isn't about stepping on toes, Lacey, Tommy said. This is about ensuring we don't have more casualties.
I can handle myself, Lacey said.
I know that. But you need to listen to me. You can't keep doing this to yourself, Tommy said. You don't have to go alone.
I'm not going alone, Lacey said. I've got the Marines with me. The pair immediately replied with a hoorah and finished packing their things.
Lacey, let's think about this, Tommy said.
I've thought about it, Lacey said, and then she headed for the door. Maybe you should think about it more.
I have a town to take care of, Tommy said. People need me here. What happens if those terrorists come back?
I'll make sure I don't let that happen, Lacey answered, and then she was out the door with Baker and Fisher following her. Lacey half expected Tommy to chase her outside. He had always been protective of her, even when she was married. The pair had known each other for a long time, but Tommy seemed to be done convincing Lacey to change her mind.
What are we dealing with up there?
Fisher asked. I counted at least a dozen fighters, Lacey said. Probably more. They took the cliff trail to the highest point in the park. Lacey frowned as she considered where the terrorists were positioning themselves. It wasn't just the highest point on the park, but one of the highest points in the state. Moreover, it was the only high elevation in the state with a trail blaze to move their equipment easily. I think they're trying to get a signal, Lacey said. They have missiles.
What kind of firepower are we talking about?
Baker asked. I don't know, Lacey answered. But they were the size of a small boat. Baker and Fisher exchanged glances.
Those guys are well connected,
Baker said.
You can't just buy missiles offline. What do they want?
Don't know and don't care, Lacey answered. I just want them out of my forest. It was as truthful an answer as Lacey could give. But her children wouldn't be safe until the threat was handled. Thankfully, the Marines were sure-footed on their trek to Big Rock Welcome Center. Lacey didn't want to take the roads. The woods made it easier for them to stay hidden. The day was getting hotter, and Lacey was soaked in sweat by the time they reached the top of the mountain. After Lacey's altercation with the enemy and freeing of the civilians, it appeared the terrorists had doubled down on securing the area. They had guards stationed around the entire welcome center and had blockaded the entrance to the park.
Looks like some heavy hitters,
Baker said.
You didn't tell us we'd be facing a small army,
Fisher said. Do you think they could be former military? Lacey asked.
Maybe,
Baker said.
I know a few guys who got into some extreme shit after they left the service. Real cuckoo brain stuff, you know?
Lacey did her best to stay off the internet. She didn't need to add more stress to her life than necessary. Right. So what's the best play here? Lacey asked. I'm not a military strategist, and you guys have done stuff like this before, right? Both men studied the situation, then glanced at each other and nodded.
Guerrilla time,
Baker said.
We need to attack from multiple angles,
Fisher replied.
Considering that we're only 3, we must make the enemy think they're surrounded.
Shock and awe, Baker said. We hit them all at the same time, give them everything we've got, and then we see if we can get them to scatter or cluster.
The goal is to pin them down, put their backs against the wall,
Fisher answered. Lacey knew the park better than anyone, and she had a good idea where they would be able to push the terrorists. There's a steep ravine on the other side of the parking lot, Lacey said. If we can push them toward that, it should buy us the kind of time we need.
Pushed over the edge, keep the high ground. It could work,
Fisher said.
We'll go on my mark,
Baker said. We need to hit the 3 widest points to act as a net and push the bastards toward that ravine.
I'll take the center. Fish, you take the right. Lacey, you go left. Don't start shooting until I give the word. I'll give everyone 5 minutes to get into position, so move your ass and get comfortable. We don't stop shooting until we can get them to scramble. And we don't reveal ourselves until they have their backs against the wall, Fisher said. We don't want to give them a chance to build momentum and regroup.
Right, Lacey said, and the rush of nerves triggered a tremor in her hand. It had been a long time since she'd been afraid, but this wasn't in her job description. But nevertheless, she'd taken an oath to defend this land. And that was exactly what she was going to do. Chapter 19. It was an impossible task, and Tommy knew it. People had seen the trucks pass through the town. More of the same enemy they had just repelled from their township. Everybody was worried and wanted answers, and Tommy feared the one person who could help him obtain those answers had just gone to fight a battle she might lose.
Sheriff?
Milton stood nearby. His relationship with Lacey constantly agitated him, especially after the incident with her husband. But while Milton was a good cop, he was a lousy judge of character.
We need to establish some kind of response.
Right, Tommy replied. Well, we should establish a failsafe to ensure that whoever leaves the town to go to the capital can return. And what happens if they don't return?
I think I have a better idea,
Milton said.
My grandfather had a radio, real old. I don't think it runs on any computer chips. If we can get power to it somehow, we might be able to scan the airwaves for signals. And it could be a way for us to contact the emergency personnel.
Sir, Deputy Townsend stepped forward.
We have a group outside dealing with a problem with their medication. They don't have enough to get through the week, and they're all wondering if the situation will stretch beyond that time.
Tommy knew the answer, but didn't have the heart to tell those people the truth. But he thought he could do them one better.
What kind of medication do they need?
Townsend led Tommy out to the front of the building. They had decided to limit the number of people inside the sheriff's station to ensure they had some operating space. If Tommy opened those doors and let people rush inside, he would lose control of the situation. And in a crisis, control was the only card he had left to play. The moment Tommy stepped outside, he was bombarded with questions. Everyone wanted to know when help was coming, when they could get their medicine, and why the power hadn't returned yet. Tommy raised his hand and gestured for everyone to stay quiet.
Please, one at a time.
He waited for the crowd shouting to die down, then cleared his throat as he addressed everyone.
I understand the situation with the medication. Now, if all of you can give Deputy Townsend here a list of what you need and how much. There is a hospital down in Winston-Salem that might be able to help us. They have an emergency stockpile of medications as one of the state's disaster response units. Last year, I worked with them on a program about disaster preparedness with the state. They'll have what we need.
The news quieted the crowd, and Tommy was glad to see their anger had slowly deflated. If there was one thing he wanted to avoid, it was people taking matters into their own hands, like a certain forest ranger. But Tommy didn't have time to think about Lacey. That was her prerogative if she wanted to go up there and get into trouble. Those terrorists were out of his town, and until they walked back into his jurisdiction, they weren't his problem. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. Once Townsend had noted all the information from the people who needed medication, Tommy fielded a few more questions about food and water. They already had a plan for food and rations, and the wells were still working, as long as they didn't mind doing a self-pump. With each question from every worried citizen, Tommy managed to keep them calm, relaxed, and reassured. He loved his community. He loved the people in town, and sometimes when a person was scared, they didn't need to be shouted at or told falsehoods. They just needed someone to help guide them. That was how Tommy had always viewed his position with the sheriff's department. He might have been charged with enforcing the law, but he felt a duty to do more than uphold the law. He wanted to maintain decency. Tommy figured that made him old-fashioned in the eyes of many people. But it didn't make his desires any less noble. He wanted to be the person who could do some good in a community that had been left behind in many ways. And so far, it had been working. But now, this catastrophe would set back all their progress as a community. Tommy refused to accept that they couldn't move past this. They were a resilient community. They had been through hard times before, and they had persevered. This would be no different. But for some reason, Tommy couldn't shake the idea that a dark cloud had formed over their town in the form of those terrorists on the mountain. Tommy returned to the holding cells, where only 2 men were in custody. The first was the poacher, Eddie, whom Tommy and Lacey had captured in the morning. The second was one of the terrorists. It was the terrorist Tommy wanted to speak to.
"What are you guys doing up on Big Rock?"
Tommy asked. The terrorist was still sitting on the cot. He was in a separate cell from Eddie. He had his head down and ignored Tommy.
"Hey,"
Tommy said, kicking the iron bars.
"you're lucky to be alive. We could have let you die with that bullet hole in you. But you didn't,"
he said, head still down.
"I guess that's the difference between a guy like you and me."
He looked up at Tommy.
"I don't hesitate to pull the trigger."
Tommy stiffened.
"You talk now, and your cooperation might buy you some goodwill with the prosecution when this goes to trial."
The man laughed.
"Trial? Do you think I signed up for this because I thought I would survive?"
He stood up.
"You're dumber than you look, Sheriff." "So help me understand,"
Tommy said.
"What is it you're hoping to accomplish? You could have come into town and shot up the place, killing a lot more people, but you didn't. It was the same as all those visitors at the park's welcome center. Why keep them alive?" "We wanted some hostages as an insurance policy,"
he replied.
"But that won't matter now. I heard the trucks. It's almost done."
Tommy was about to speak again, but then Eddie stepped into the conversation before he could open his mouth.
"You're wasting your time with him," Eddie said. "He won't tell you what you want. He's a zealot, a true believer." "And what does he believe?" Tommy asked. "That he's right," Eddie answered. "People who believe they're right, no matter what, are always the most dangerous animals."
Tommy studied Eddie. The man was more observant than he let on.
"What did you see up there? And what were they planning?" "I know they'll succeed," Eddie said. "Whatever it is."
Tommy grimaced.
"This is a waste of time."
He turned to leave, but Eddie wasn't finished.
"You can't save her," Eddie said.
Tommy stopped, and then looked back at the man behind the bars.
"Excuse me?"
"The forest ranger," Eddie answered.
"I know a death wish when I see one, and that woman doesn't want to return from whatever hell she's been burning in." "You don't know what you're talking about," Tommy said. "Yes, I do," Eddie said. "I've been all around the world and hunted all kinds of animals. The most dangerous beasts in the world. And I've killed them all. But what your ranger is facing, what they're about to walk into, is more dangerous than anything you could possibly imagine. Those wild animals up on that mountain are feral. They're out for blood, and they'll die to get it." "You're the only wild animal I see," Tommy said. "I'm a keystone species," Eddie said. "I'm the one who keeps the balance." "You're a smuggler and a killer," Tommy said. "Nothing more." "I pick off the weak, Sheriff," Eddie said. "And it makes the herd grow stronger. I suspect that's what these people are trying to do." "You're all crazy," Tommy said, "and there's no reasoning with crazy." "Well," Eddie said, leaning closer to the bars. "If you come here, I'll tell you a secret that might help you win this fight." Tommy studied Eddie, who was eyeing him cautiously. "Or you can take your chances up there alone, but the choice is yours," Eddie said, shrugging. Tommy sighed, and he stepped closer. "A little more," Eddie said. Tommy moved within a foot, but Eddie shook his head. "I don't want your friend over here in the next room," he said, pointing to the terrorist, who was now watching them with interest. Tommy grimaced, but eventually moved closer. Just a few inches away, he could smell the stink on Eddie. The man had been out in the woods for a long time, and God knows when he'd showered last. "She doesn't love you," Eddie said. "Never will." Tommy jerked back, fighting his desire to punch the man in the face. Eddie laughed, and Tommy walked away. But the sheriff was too distracted to notice that Eddie had stolen one of the pins off of Tommy's uniform. Eddie wanted out.
And now, he had the means to escape. Chapter 20. Taylor Jenkins stood at the top of the mountain, surveying the acres of untouched land around him. He stood at attention, arms behind his back, his posture straight and rigid. As unyielding as the mountains he stood on. But for this mission, for what they had done and what they still needed to accomplish, Jenkins was the leader their movement needed. There had been too much talk for too long, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. The EMP had been Jenkins' idea. The country's infrastructure was poorly protected to handle such an attack, and he had used those vulnerabilities to his advantage. Millions would die in the coming days and weeks, but it was a necessary purge. The country had grown weak, and it was his purpose to make it strong again. He cared little for weaknesses or the rule of law. It was Jenkins' destiny to rid society of the weak. And he considered himself the judge, jury, and executioner. Anyone who stood in his way would be killed, and there was no one left to stop him. "Sir." One of the foot soldiers Jenkins had recruited saluted Jenkins, even though none of them had ever been involved in the military. But they had trained themselves, proclaimed their band of fighters as liberators, but the only people they helped were themselves.
"The machine is nearly finished being set up." "Good,"
Jenkins said, still staring out over the mountains.
"Bring the students up here so we can enter the coding sequence. I want this done before nightfall to ensure maximum destruction on our targets." "Yes, sir."
The yes man spun around and set the process into motion. Jenkins drew in a breath of fresh mountain air, closing his eyes and marveling at his own magnificence.
Too easy.
Jenkins had never anticipated any resistance. He had full confidence in his men to get the job done. The fact that they had been able to do so much in such a short amount of time spoke volumes about the state of the country. Jenkins imagined he would be branded a traitor. He imagined people would call him a madman, too, but he had never been thinking more clearly than now. He saw what others could not, and soon they would understand him. Jenkins planned to target every major city in the southeast, stretching from Atlanta to Raleigh. He also had a list of military targets to weaken any retaliation response against him. Jenkins was assured that the missiles he had purchased from an arms dealer in Colombia were more than enough to level the entire city block. And because Jenkins had a few dozen of them, he planned on killing as many of them as he could. Then, when night fell, he would sleep like a baby. When the college students from Wake Forest were brought up the mountain, Jenkins approached the sniveling children. He detested brainiacs. There was nothing they could do that he couldn't with his strength. Well, unless it had to do with the GPS system he was set to use. However, Jenkins was confident that his intimidation and threat of violence would force the students to listen to him. If threats didn't work, then actions would. Jenkins had gotten far in life with nothing more than his brute strength. He had been ridiculed as a child and a young man for having no vision. Well, he was about to share his vision with the rest of the world before the day was done.
"I'll show them,"
Jenkins whispered, clenching in anger.
"I'll show them all."
The only flaw in Jenkins's plan, at least the way that he could see it, was he didn't have enough firepower to hit every city all over the country. But this was only phase 1 of his master plan. He needed the country to weaken itself. He needed neighbors to turn on one another and destroy themselves, while Jenkins waited in the weeds for the right time to strike again. Jenkins had plans of commandeering resources, food, water, medicine, and ammunition, to attract people to his cause. His offer was simple: join him and be rewarded with the resources to survive, or refuse and die. Simple, just the way Jenkins liked it.
"Sir, they're here,"
the foot soldier said. Jenkins turned around and stared at the cowering college students. None of them had fought back. It had been like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, except for that one student who had attacked his men and stolen their code book they needed to operate the satellite. He was still fuming over their failure to find that particular troublemaker.
We need the codes to sync our system to the satellite and GPS system,
Jenkins said.
Who knows how to do it?
None of the students moved or spoke. They stared up at him with the same doe-eyed expression of fear they had worn since they were abducted. None of them had any inkling of what it took to seize true power.
I'll make this simple for you all,
Jenkins said, and then he removed the pistol from his hip holster, keeping it at his side.
The first person who steps forward and tells me how to start the coding sequence on the computer will be allowed to live. The rest of you will die.
Still, none of the students stepped forward, so Jenkins reached for one of the girls, grabbing her by the scruff of her neck and placed the gun to her head.
Someone better start talking or I'm pulling the trigger,
Jenkins said. We don't know the sequence. Another girl stepped forward. Our professor never got around to showing us.
That's not good news for your friend here,
Jenkins said. You're an animal, the girl said, grimacing as her anger burned through her fear. We won't help you kill more people. Even if we did know the sequence, we wouldn't tell you. Our professor died to keep that information from you. It would be a stain on his memory to share anything with you.
Well,
Jenkins said.
Finally a little backbone. I like that.
Jenkins aimed at the girl who'd spoken up and shot her through the head, triggering screams from the other students. But Jenkins couldn't stand all their sniveling and tears, and he fired another gunshot into the air.
Quiet!
Jenkins roared. The students finally piped down, most of them staring down at their dead friend, whose blood slowly poured from the hole in her head and spread across the rocks.
Now, I'm going to ask again,
Jenkins said, returning the pistol to the girl's head that he still had in his possession.
Who knows how to start the sequencing code?
When no one spoke up, Jenkins' anger boiled over into rage. Did these snowflakes not understand what was going to happen to them? Did they not believe him even after killing one of their friends? I can do it. Jenkins turned his ire to the young man who had stepped forward. He was trembling and couldn't look Jenkins in the eye, but he had been the only one to move. But I won't help you if you hurt anyone else, he said, head down.
Is that a threat?
Jenkins growled. The boy cowered again, but he finally looked up at Jenkins, eyes watery but defiant. Yes. Jenkins grimaced. He wasn't in the mood to deal with any of this, but he was short on time and patience, so he shoved the girl he'd been holding back into the group of students.
Fine,
Jenkins said.
But if you fail me, I'm going to make you pick which one of your friends I kill first.
Chapter 21. Lacey waited in position in the woods. She had never been part of a fight that was so calculated. Until now, Lacey had fought out of survival. So far, she had been the hunted, but she was on the offensive now. Time passed slowly as Lacey waited for the Marines to set the fight into motion. Lacey had never been impatient, but the anticipation of the fight was making her anxious. She was holding back with all her adrenaline, but the dam was about to burst. Her body hummed with anticipation, but Lacey wasn't sure whether it was nerves or excitement. Lacey already had her eyes on the target she would first hit. She had followed the terrorists in her crosshairs since she had found her position. Her finger was on the trigger. All it would take was 5 pounds of pressure, and the man would be dead. Lacey couldn't help but wonder what these men were doing here and why they had joined this terrible cause. It was clear to her, based on the conversations she had overheard with the terrorists, that these were some homegrown Americans. They had different dialects from around the country, some of them from out west, others up north, and a few farther south. Still, it was the same type of mannerisms and cultural dialects that identified them as Americans. It appeared that madness had gripped these men. But she wondered who was calling the shots. What had pushed them to the brink of wanting to start a war? It didn't make sense to her, but madness didn't require an explanation. The sudden effects of the EMP had shocked everybody in the community. It would be days, weeks, or even months before people understood what had happened. But if history had taught Lacey anything, it never remembered those who did nothing kindly. Despite Lacey's retreat from society, she still felt responsible for acting when she could make a difference. There was still a time when she shared all the same ideals that her young daughter represented. But life had a way of beating them down. Sean's death had accelerated that process and made her even more calloused and angrier with the world. It was easier to blame everyone else for her husband's death than to admit to herself that it was her fault he was gone. Lacey was so lost in thoughts about the past, her husband, and her family that she jumped in surprise at the first gunshot. When Baker and Fisher told her the attack would be fast, she grossly underestimated how quickly the two Marines would move. They were relentless, easily gaining ground as the terrorists retreated. The plan to attack from 3 separate angles was efficient. The enemy was immediately thrown onto their heels, put off kilter, and put on the retreat. Even though Lacey and the Marines were outnumbered 3-1, the onslaught of gunfire from their positions made it look like the other way around. Lacey pushed forward to the edge of the forest, trying to use her peripherals to see if Baker and Fisher were already out in the woods, but it was hard to tell with the action happening around them. The Marines might have been used to this type of chaos, but for Lacey, this was far more violent than anything she had been associated with. And yet, Lacey found herself easily sliding into the role of aggressor. Blood filled the air, along with the screams from the fallen. Lacey made sure to put 2 more bullets into every terrorist to ensure they stayed down. Once they had eliminated half of the terrorists, Fisher and Baker emerged from the woods and made their way over to the parking lot. But Lacey noticed that not all the enemy had clustered. One of them had sprinted away from the group, heading toward the west end of the parking lot where the trucks were located. Lacey wasn't sure if she should follow, but she didn't want him to break away and warn the others. Following her gut, Lacey sprinted after the deserter while Fisher and Baker pinned the remaining enemy down near the ravine as planned. There was nowhere else for them to go except the steep drop. Lacey moved swiftly over the hot pavement, with the gunfight growing louder behind her. The sun baked the asphalt, turning the parking lot into an outdoor oven. It was always like that during summertime, especially on sunny days. But with the summer came new threats of wildfires, and there was no telling when one would start. Lacey considered the terrorists a fire, burning through her woods, and if left unchecked, they would torch everything to the ground. The terrorist Lacey had been chasing ducked behind the back of a truck. When she neared the front of it, she slowed down, checking both sides to see if he was on either. Once she confirmed the coast was clear, she moved down the truck's driver's side. Lacey was able to hear the noises from inside of the back of the semi. The terrorist was searching for something in what sounded like boxes. She moved swiftly down the edge of the semi-truck and then craned her neck around the back edge, careful not to get caught in the line of fire in case it was a trap. When Lacey stepped around the back side of the semi-truck, she saw the terrorist was hunched over a crate. When he looked up and saw Lacey, he quickly raised the RPG he'd come to retrieve. Lacey ducked out of the way, and the terrorist fired as the rocket exploded into one of the cars in the back, narrowly missing Lacey as she hit the asphalt. The noise from the explosion cost Lacey her hearing, and there was nothing but high-pitched whine in her ears. Her entire body was humming with pain, and she was disoriented from the explosion. But one thought crept through the pain and confusion. The enemy was still inside the trailer. Lacey forced herself to her hands and knees and moved as quickly as she could toward the front of the semi. She didn't look behind her, afraid of losing momentum. It was always interesting to Lacey how quickly someone could summon their strength when they realized their life was on the line. Instinct was driving her, the will to survive, the fear of death. Lacey realized the terrorist in the truck had the same emotions. It was a battle of fear, and whoever conquered theirs first would win. Lacey ducked around to the front of the semi and then moved to her left, crossing a few more cars as she put distance between herself and the gunmen. Slowly, Lacey's senses returned to full function. The ringing in her ears faded, and the pain in her body eased. Lacey steadied herself, then poked her head up from behind the car she had hidden behind. She searched the parking lot for the terrorist and finally saw him with the RPG appear from the front of the truck. But the terrorist wasn't looking for Lacey anymore. He was focused on the fight where Fisher and Baker still had the other terrorists pinned down. Lacey planted her elbows on the car's hood and peered through the scope of her rifle. She would only get one shot at this, as the terrorist was already lining up his shot to kill the others. It was all over if she missed, and she didn't think there would be another chance to win this fight. But when Lacey peered through her scope, her vision was still blurred from the previous blast. She saw double, so Lacey aimed in the middle and squeezed the trigger. Then her knee gave out. Lacey smacked her head against the side of the car hard, and she hit the pavement again. But Lacey quickly got to her feet once more and saw the terrorist on the ground, the RPG weapon unused. But Fisher and Baker were still battling the enemy, and the terrorists had regrouped and were starting to regain the ground they had given up. Lacey saw the Marines, and then she saw the RPG on the ground. She gathered what remained of her strength and sprinted over to the weapon. Lacey scooped up the RPG and then aimed it at the terrorists who were pushing the Marines back. She couldn't stop her hand from shaking, which affected her aim. She couldn't keep the terrorists in her line of sight. Lacey forced her hand steady, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion put everyone on their asses, but when the dust settled, the terrorists were dead, and the Marines had survived. Lacey hurried over to Fisher and Baker to make sure they were okay. When she heard them laughing, she figured they were fine.
"Hell of a way to make an entrance,"
Baker said, grunting as he stood up.
"Maybe next time give us a heads up about the RPG,"
Fisher said, dusting off his pants. "I had to move fast," Lacey said, gesturing to the path. "We need to go up the trail. The terrorists were working on something here, and if they get it online, they're going to hurt a lot of people."
"How many more are there?"
Fisher asked.
"Doesn't matter,"
Baker asked.
"I'm feeling lucky."
But while Baker was ready to take on the world, Lacey didn't share in his confidence. These terrorists were dangerous, and after the fight they had narrowly escaped, Lacey wondered if going up that trail alone was a wise decision. But there is no time to get to Tommy. They needed to hike that trail and stop the enemy before they fired those missiles. While Lacey's son might not have believed she cared about anyone but herself, she was compelled by duty to intervene when she had no other choice. People's lives were at stake. The future of their community was at stake. All that mattered now was that life continued. It mattered here in the forest. It mattered in the communities across the country, and if this group of terrorists got their way, then life would decay and crumble until there was nothing left. She couldn't let that happen, not when there was a chance to make things right. Chapter 22. It was strange being home. Dusty didn't have fond memories of living in the cabin. When his mother had built it, she had done so to keep them safe after their father had died. But it ended up being a deserted island, a way for his mother to keep them isolated from the rest of society. It had been easy for Katie to move there since she was still so little, but Dusty had just entered high school. When his father had died, he'd lost more than just a parent. He'd lost his youth in the same breath. Of course, Dusty's mother had tried to make the transition easy. She had talked about how they had freedom in the woods and could explore nature in a way others couldn't. But while Dusty enjoyed the outdoors, it wasn't his passion like his mother's. She had tried everything she could to get him to warm up to the idea and live like her, but it wasn't the life he wanted. Dusty had expected his mother to be smug during their reunion. They hadn't spoken since he'd left for college, even though he called to talk to his sister. His mom picked up the phone several times, but their interactions were no longer than, "Hi, I'll get her." In a way, Dusty and Katie had lost both parents after their father had died. Their dad had been the glue that held the family together. He was the fun one who would start dance parties in the living room for no reason. He was the one who would let them play hooky from school and see a movie. He was the one who left notes in their lunches with a funny joke and a word of encouragement. Dusty knew his mother loved him. She just showed that love in different ways. Their mother was a planner, and that planning led them to live this self-sufficient, off-the-grid cabin in the middle of the woods on the side of a mountain. They had everything they needed and a little more. They never went hungry, and they were never cold during the winter. They had medicine when they were sick, and books to read and learn. And it wasn't like they were completely isolated, but Dusty and Katie would always have to be the ones to push their mother to go into town. Now, their mother was out in the woods, and Dusty and Katie were again relegated to the cabin. Dusty was a grown man, but sitting on the couch in their tiny living room, he felt like he did when he was 13, learning about his father's death, feeling helpless, angry, and confused about everything happening in his life. "Hey," Claire said, sitting beside him on the couch. "Are you okay?" It was a loaded question. Dusty didn't want to appear like a sulking child, but he couldn't stop the overwhelming need to act before it was too late. Dusty stood, catching the attention of his girlfriend and his sister, who was sprawled out on the floor, coloring. "I'm going into town," Dusty said, and then he headed for the door, prompting both girls to stand up and try to stop him. "Mom told you to stay here," Katie said. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Claire asked. "I don't have time to explain, but I need to convince the sheriff and as many townspeople as I can to help me get to the mountain and make sure those terrorists don't fire those missiles," Dusty said. "Then I'm coming with you," Claire said. "Me too," Katie replied. "No," Dusty said, stopping them. "Both of you are going to stay here." "Why?" they asked simultaneously, sporting the same look of discernment and anger, but Dusty wasn't in the mood to negotiate. "Because I need to know the two of you are safe," Dusty said. Claire rolled her eyes. "All of a sudden it's about safety. I escaped from the campus too, Dusty. I saw what those people were doing. They're monsters and they need to be stopped, and you need as many people as possible to help you." "What she said," Katie replied, and the two girls gathered their jackets. Dusty didn't think it was any use in stopping them, but he had one card left to play. "If anything happens to the two of you, I won't be able to forgive myself." "And if anything happens to you, we'd feel the same way," Claire replied. "Yeah," Katie said. "It's different for me," Dusty said, "because—" Dusty stopped himself. He was about to say it was because he was a man, but he knew that wouldn't land well with these two strong-willed women before him. They both looked at him with raised eyebrows, crossed arms, and hips cocked to the side. Dusty bowed his head. He couldn't find the right words to explain his feelings and feared losing them. "It's not fair for me to ask you to stay," Dusty said, "but I need you to do this for me. I understand you can handle yourself." He looked at his little sister. "Both of you. But I can't lose any more people I care about. And if anything happened to either of you because you came with me, I'd never forgive myself." "And how would we feel if something happened to you?" Claire asked. "I love you, Dusty Stone." It was the first time she'd said that, throwing Dusty off kilter. But it was all the confirmation she needed for why he wanted her to stay here. "I love you too," Dusty said. "So please do this for me. Stay here, watch my sister. You're the only person I can trust to keep her safe." Claire softened at the mention of trust, and she reluctantly nodded. "No!" Katie shouted, stomping her feet. "You can't leave!" Dusty dropped to a knee and held his little sister's hands. "I'll be fine." "Don't go!" Katie answered, sobbing. "Please, I don't want to lose you too." She lunged forward and squeezed Dusty tight. Dusty hugged her back. "You're not going to lose me. I promise." "That's not a promise you can keep," Katie said. "Yes, it is," Dusty answered. "I will keep it, no matter what." He pulled back and wiped the tears from Katie's eyes. "I promise you that nothing will stop me from coming back home."
You're my family, Katie. I love you.
I love you too, Katie said, calming herself down. Once Dusty packed up his gear, he kissed Claire again and stepped out of the cabin. He had left this cabin hundreds of times before, maybe even thousands of times, but this felt different. The woods, the air, the very essence of his being told Dusty he was about to embark on the most important journey of his life. And it wasn't just his life that was at stake. Countless others would be killed if those terrorists succeeded. Dusty hurried down the mountain, wanting to reach town as fast as possible. He didn't know what was happening in the state park. But the fact that his mother was still gone didn't bode well for the situation. For a brief moment, Dusty thought his mother might have died. But he quickly shoved the thought back into the darkest corners of his mind. He didn't want to think about that. But Dusty was surprised at how the thought of losing his mother had made him feel. After all the times they had butted heads, after the years of feuds and stretches of silence, his heart broke at the very thought of losing his mother. The pair might have their differences, and they rarely saw eye to eye on the world and what was happening, but he still loved her. She was still his mother. The pair had a bond that stretched beyond their petty arguments. And the thought of losing her, after spending so much time not speaking to one another, only made Dusty all the more anxious to get up the mountain to make sure that she was okay. Thankfully, the trek to town was all downhill, making the trip short. From a distance, the town looked untouched. But the closer Dusty moved toward the buildings and the street, he realized there were bodies on the pavement. The sheriff's deputies were removing some of them, but aside from the deputies moving bodies, the town was silent. Their community had always been close-knit. Before Dusty's father had died, he had remembered coming here and seeing how friendly everyone was. But after his father's death, people had looked at him differently. They didn't treat him like they treated his mother. They weren't cruel or mean, but they whispered things behind his back, and Dusty often heard what they said. It was all rumors. That was what Dusty had told himself. He couldn't imagine any of what they were saying as truth, but during his teenage years of angst and rage, he had allowed those rumors to get to him. But the idea that his mother would have killed his dad was insane. His mother loved his dad. That much was clear. Only a heartbroken woman would have moved her 2 children into the middle of the woods and away from what few friends they had in the community. But Dusty wasn't there to rehash the past. He was there to gather as many people as possible to end the threat at the state park. And he was convinced that there was only one person who could help him. Sheriff Tommy was a good friend of Dusty's family. Of all the people who had shunned his mother, Tommy had stood by her side. The pair had always been close growing up. Tommy and his mother were friends when they were kids, so Tommy was like an uncle to Dusty and Katie. He was the one who investigated his father's death and had assured him the death was an accident. Of course, even an official report wasn't good enough for the town. Everyone wanted to believe the gossip, but Dusty wanted his family back together. "Tommy," Dusty said, catching the sheriff outside and speaking to a few locals. "Dusty," Tommy asked, smiling and embracing Dusty in a hug. "Thank God you're all right." He leaned back and looked Dusty up and down. "How are you?" But then his excitement transformed into concern. "Wait, what are you doing here? Is everyone all right? Where's your sister?" "We need everyone who can fight to go up to the mountain right now before it's too late," Dusty said. "Dusty, there's a lot we need to get done," Tommy said. "Your mother? She has every right to do what she wants, but people here need my help, and that's where I will give it." "You don't understand. There won't be a town left if we don't stop them," Dusty said. "We've already pushed them back, kid," Deputy Milton said. "They're not our problem anymore." Dusty glanced around, realizing that was a sentiment the entire town shared. "It's not your problem right now, but I promise it will be." He pointed to the mountain where the park was located. They have missiles up there, and a system that can send the weapons anywhere they want. How many people do you think will die? How much blood do you want on your hands?" All of them glanced around, but no one stepped forward. "You all think my mother is a monster," Dusty said. "But she's not. She's up there fighting to protect people she's never even met, that she'll never meet. And she's not doing it to be a hero. She's doing it because it's the right thing to do. And that's what I'm asking of you. Just do the right thing. Please." Dusty waited with bated breath. He wasn't sure if his words would reach the community or the sheriff, but he had given everything he could to the cause. It was in their hands now. Chapter 23. Lacey was tired, and it was more than just fatigue from the day. She had been glad to see her son, but he was clearly still upset with her. She didn't know how long the pair would be angry with one another, but the path to fixing their relationship continued to be uphill, much like the hike up the mountain. Lacey wanted a better relationship with Dusty. She had wanted it for a long time, but they had been so icy toward one another for the past few years, and it had been hard to thaw. Much like climbing this mountain, it would be a hard-fought hike to win back the trust she had lost with her son. Sean's death had affected all of them, but it had hit Dusty the hardest. Lacey had done everything she could think of to keep her son from spiraling out of control. But it was hard to help someone when she was still hurting herself. Lacey had done everything to avoid feeling the loss of her husband, but that was only because of the trauma she had experienced at his death. She still had nightmares about that day, about finding him and hearing the gunshot. Lacey shut her eyes and stopped walking, prompting Fisher and Baker to pause. "What's wrong?" Baker asked.
"Did you see something?"
Fisher asked, scanning their surroundings. "No, it's nothing," Lacey asked. "Just tired." "Are you sure you're up for this?" Baker asked.
"Yeah, we don't need no dead weight,"
Fisher replied.
"No offense, we appreciate you saving our asses back there, but we can't afford a weak link in the chain, you know?"
"I'm fine," Lacey said. "I can handle it." Lacey tabled her thoughts about her son and focused on the fight ahead. She didn't know how many more terrorists could be in this organization, but they had to be getting to the end of the line. And then, as they neared one of the bends on their hike to the lookout at the top of the trail, Lacey heard voices. Baker and Fisher were the first to react, and Lacey followed their lead. All three moved off the trail and hid in the woods. The trio had their weapons ready, but Fisher whispered in her ear.
"No guns,"
Fisher said.
"This is most likely a group heading back to check on the others. If we start shooting, it could alert more of them."
Lacey frowned. "Then how do we stop them?" But the moment she spoke, she saw Fisher and Baker remove their knives.
"If you can't do it, it's fine,"
Baker said. "We've got this." "No," Lacey said, and then she set her gun down and removed her hunting knife. "I can do this." Lacey adjusted her grip on the hunting knife, feeling the sweat on her palm. She was shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. And as the terrorists finally emerged from around the corner, she saw that there were 3 of them. One for each, Lacey thought. They had their masks down, and Lacey saw each of their faces. They were all men, each with a hardened stare as they strolled down the pathway. She thought back to the men who had come through her town, the same ones who had come to her house and wanted to steal her supplies, the food and water she had for her family. These men had come here to do one thing: kill. And if that was their cause, then Lacey had to stop them, because these terrorists were a cancer, and she needed to cut them out and save the rest of them before they all died. Lacey waited on Fisher and Baker, looking to them for cues. They were already close to the edge of the road. Thankfully, the brush was thick, concealing them from the road's view. Not that the enemy was looking for them. The trio was too concentrated on their conversation, and their distraction would be their undoing. When the terrorists were less than a few feet away, Lacey waited until she was confident the enemy was within her grasp, and then when she saw Fisher and Baker move in her peripheral, she made her move too. Baker and Fisher managed to kill their targets without any problems, slicing the blade across the flesh and covering their victim's mouth to keep them quiet. It was a move they had used before, but by the time Lacey reached her target, he had managed to scream before Lacey could get her hands on him. The man also brandished a knife, which forced Lacey to drop her own as she stopped him from using it against her. She barely managed to keep the enemy still and was forced to improvise with no weapon. Hearing the snap of the spine, the guy immediately went limp in her arms. She let him go, and he collapsed to the ground like a sack of meat.
Brutal,
Fisher said. Lacey caught her breath as she stared down at the dead man on the ground. His mouth was open, and his tongue was sticking out. Lacey looked away, unable to stare at the dead man for much longer. And then she turned her attention toward the others. "We need to keep moving," Lacey said. "Right," Baker said, and he wiped the blood from his blade on the pant leg of the dead terrorist. "Let's get going." Lacey glanced down at the dead terrorist one more time. She had racked up quite the body count, and while those men had deserved to die, Lacey felt a piece of herself chip away with every life she took. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up, but she was fully aware of the number of enemies waiting for her at the top of the mountain. After another 10 minutes of hiking, Lacey noticed Fisher favoring his left leg. "You all right?"
"Fine,"
Fisher said, grimacing and touching his right hip.
"Bester got me good before I stuck him. Course it had to be my bad hip."
"Can you make it the rest of the way?" Lacey asked.
"Yeah, I'm good."
Fisher winced and stumbled, but Baker and Lacey were there to catch him.
"Shit, maybe not."
Lacey and Baker slowly helped Fisher to the ground, and Lacey took a closer look at the wound on his hip. She saw the terrorist had done way more than just get him and examined the gash that went nearly all the way to the bone. "This needs stitches," Lacey said. "You've soaked your pant leg in blood."
"I thought I was just sweaty,"
Fisher said, but he was already pale-faced. When Lacey started to help him, Fisher batted her away.
"You don't have time for this."
"You need help," Lacey said. Baker glanced around them, keeping a lookout, but he was clearly on edge.
"Guys, we're sitting ducks here. We need to make a move."
"Go," Lacey said, standing up. "Get him back down the mountain and get him help."
"And what the hell are you gonna do?"
Fisher asked. "I'm going to finish this," Lacey said. "Going up there alone is dangerous," Baker said.
"I can do this. Just give me a second."
Fisher tried to stand, but the moment he got to his feet, he collapsed again, finding it harder than the first time.
"Yeah, that's not going to work,"
Baker replied. "Get him back into town," Lacey said. "I'll do some recon, then I'll come back down and we can regroup."
"You're sure you want to do this?"
Baker asked. "I know this mountain better than anyone," Lacey said. "They won't see me unless I want them to." Baker nodded, and then helped Fisher up.
"Be safe. And don't do anything we wouldn't do."
Baker winked, and then helped Fisher down the trail. Lacey stood there for a moment, alone in the woods. She had done this hike thousands of times before, but this was different. This would be a fight for everyone else's lives on the mountain and beyond. Lacey readied herself for the final leg of the trail and continued. She chose to stay off the path to keep herself hidden. It was a little harder to climb, but her stealth was now her biggest ally. Lacey tried to make herself believe that this was just another hunting expedition, even though there was much more at stake. It would be too overwhelming if she thought about it for too long. She was just one person, fully aware that she couldn't take on an army. But she had something to fight for and defend. Her family and home. She wouldn't lose sight of that. It fueled her fire, and right now, that fire was burning hot. Lacey eventually neared the crest of the mountain and the end of the trail, and she heard the voices of the terrorists waiting for her at the top of the hill. Lacey remained off the trail, And it was a good thing she did, too, because the moment she would have rounded the bend, the terrorist standing guard would have spotted her. She took her time, moving up to a better vantage point, pushing through the thick brush, the branches and bushes grabbing at her clothes as they tried to slow her down. Lacey was quiet, though, able to move through the woods even in the thick brush without so much as a whisper. For all the terrorists knew, it was just a few bugs crawling through the forest, posing no threat to them. Lacey finally reached a good vantage point off the trail and saw the overlook where the terrorists had set up. The missile system was already in place, along with a large machine with a satellite link. Lacey saw a group of students around Dusty's age huddled together, corralled at gunpoint by two of the terrorists. But one of the students was near the computer system next to the missiles. He was hunched over the terminal, working frantically while a big man stood behind him, glowering angrily. And when Lacey called him a big man, she meant a giant. Even from that distance, Lacey could tell the monster was close to 6.5 feet tall. She pegged him as the ringleader. But if they were still working on establishing a connection with the satellite, then Lacey had arrived in time. It was good news for anyone who might have been on the receiving end of those missiles, but Lacey didn't know how much time she had left before they solved their problem. One thing was certain for her. Lacey knew that if that machine was taken down, those terrorists would be dead in the water. Lacey doubted the casing of the device was strong enough to withstand a few rounds of bullets from her rifle, and she positioned herself to line up a shot. The device was skinny, and both men were in the way of her target. She considered trying to shoot through them, but the moment she pulled the trigger, other terrorists would immediately hone in on her location. Lacey counted at least another dozen that had made it to the top of the mountain, and it was more than she could take out on her own if it came to a fight. She would need to destroy the device and get out of there before they pinned down her location. But as Lacey aimed, she didn't realize the log she was positioned on was rotted from the inside out. But as she waited for her shot, the weight from her upper body and the gun caused the log to crumble beneath her, and the noise attracted the attention of every single terrorist on the lookout. Chapter 24. The moment the log collapsed, Lacey's cover was blown. The terrorists immediately mobilized toward the woods and Lacey's location. With her cover lost, Lacey saw no need to keep quiet, so she aimed for the device again. However, the terrorists were smart. The two men working at the console had already moved it behind a rock for protection. "Shit," Lacey said. But Lacey didn't have time to dwell on it as two more terrorists moved into the woods, forcing her to flee. Lacey tried shooting back, but shooting on the run was difficult. She fired blindly, hoping her sporadic gunfire managed to strike one of the terrorists in pursuit. The gunfire grew more relentless as Lacey made her way farther down the trail, and the terrorists chased after her. She would have gone farther off the main path, but the steep drop-off behind her was almost at a 90-degree angle because of their high altitude. One wrong move, and she would tumble 300 feet to her death. It seemed that no matter how fast she moved, the terrorists continued to stay hot on her heels. More than once, Lacey felt the bullets graze past her, moving within inches of striking her arm, leg, and head. She'd never been on the run like that before, never hunted. Even though her body told her to run, she knew she needed to stand and fight. Lacey tucked herself behind the rocks, the jagged pieces of granite scraping against her arms, legs, and back. She gave herself 3 seconds to calm down and refocus her efforts into fighting back. She had been surviving for a long time now, 5 years since her husband had died. 5 years of holding on with both hands, wondering if today was the day she would break. But the past 5 years had taught her that she was stronger than she realized. She had managed to hold on and build a life for herself in the middle of nowhere with nothing but her 2 hands and sheer will. She had done it all while raising and taking care of 2 children, while the community she had once called home had ostracized her. Lacey would not die today. She would not allow these monsters to enter her home and forest and do what they wanted. Of all the people they could have picked a fight with, of all the places they could have gone, she would make them understand that Big Rock was her home, and she would protect it with her life. When the 3 seconds ended, Lacey stepped around the corner in the trail bend. She was exposed beyond the rocks, and when she stared through the sights of her rifle, time slowed down. The enemy chasing after her was still reeling from the adrenaline and the chaos of the chase, but Lacey had already moved past that. And before they could strike her with one of their bullets, Lacey had landed 2 quick blows to the terrorists running down the hill. Lacey ducked back behind the rocks to shield herself from the retaliatory gunfire. But before she spun around, she noticed the men had slowed. The 2 quick deaths had stolen the thunder from their attack. It was the momentum shift Lacey needed to stay alive. Up until now, they believed they were untouchable. The show of force, the blitzkrieg through the town, and the advanced weapons all fed into their belief that they were better fighters. But none of them had Lacey's grit or determination. They were fighting for selfish reasons, but Lacey fought for the sake of others. The longer Lacey stood her ground, the more enemy fighters gathered on the other side of the bend. She counted at least 6 the last time she exposed herself to their gunfire, and the longer they drew the fight out, the calmer the enemy was becoming. She needed to change it up again to keep them on their toes. Lacey glanced up at the rock she was using as cover. 12 feet up was a level plateau. If she climbed to the top, she'd have the high ground. And it would be like shooting fish in a barrel from that position. But if Lacey didn't make it to the top before the enemy rushed forward, then she would die, clinging to the rocks and falling to her death. It was risky, but Lacey decided to remain on the offensive. She found the first foothold in the rocks and hoisted herself off the ground. She moved quickly. She used to be an avid climber, so the trek wasn't too challenging for her, but it had been a few years since she had climbed. The muscle memory helped, and it wasn't long before Lacey moved up the rock face at a steady clip. But she heard the enemy moving closer, and she knew she would lose whatever momentum she gained if she didn't double-time it. Lacey glanced down as she pressed her palm over the flat surface of the top rock and saw 2 fighters finally muster the courage to try to take her head-on. But by the time they looked up, she already had her legs swung over the side. And when they fired at her, they were already in retreat, and Lacey didn't waste any time using her new position with the high ground. She fired into the enemy, quickly striking 2 more even as they shot up at her. But Lacey had them on the run now. For a moment, she believed she had gained the upper hand. But then she saw the rocket launcher, and she immediately rolled away, narrowly avoiding the missile that blasted the side of the mountain. Rock and dust flew up, and the force of the jagged blast knocked Lacey into the mountainside so hard that one of the jagged rocks cut into the flesh of her left shoulder. The pain caused her to scream, and she yanked her shoulder from the rock, causing blood to spurt. Lacey applied pressure to the wound, which cost her the grip on her weapon. Her ears were ringing from the explosion, but she could hear the muffled screams of the enemy below, all of them questioning if they'd gotten her and she was dead. It was only a matter of time before the enemy decided to climb the mountain to check on her, or fire another rocket. Lacey applied a quick bandage to her wounded shoulder to stop the bleeding, but the pain prevented her from using her rifle with her left arm. She heaved it up with her right arm, then moved toward the edge of the cliff. Lacey was running on fumes, but wouldn't die without a fight. If this was going to be her end, she was going to go down swinging. When she neared the edge of the cliff and glanced down at the enemy below, it was clear to her that this was the final stand. As she lined up her shot, struggling to do so with only her right arm, Lacey wished she would have done more with her children. But deep down, she knew they understood how much she loved them, even if she didn't always say it aloud. But when the enemy aimed up toward Lacey, she finally had one of them in her sights. But just before she squeezed the trigger, another roar of gunfire came farther down the trail. Lacey almost didn't glance back because she figured it was gunfire directed toward her. She at least wanted to finish her last shot, but she soon realized the gunfire was directed at the enemy below. Lacey glanced behind her and saw familiar faces marching up the trail. The sheriff, the deputies, and a few town members. But the face that surprised her more than any other was her son's. Dusty was leading the charge up the mountain alongside Tommy. And while Lacey was proud, that pride was quickly overridden with anger that he had disobeyed her and put his life on the line, even if it was to save hers. The show of force from the town put the enemy on their heels, and they quickly retreated toward the top of the trail. Once they were out of sight, Lacey carefully descended the rock face with her one good arm, dropping the rifle down, and Dusty and Tommy were there to catch her. "Your shoulder," Dusty said, and he immediately started to work on the wound. Lacey's anger toward her son for disobeying her softened when she saw his concern. He immediately started dressing the wound with the first aid kit in his pack, putting the gun down to do what he did best, take care of people. "I told you to stay in the cabin," Lacey said. Dusty sighed. "Mom, I was wrong," Lacey said. Dusty glanced up at her, a mixture of surprise and confusion on her face. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," Lacey said. "And if you hadn't come, I would have died up there." "Your son convinced the town that it was better to do something proactive than to sit back and do nothing," Tommy said. Lacey studied the townsfolk who had come to fight. Whether they were here to fight with her or simply protect their homes didn't matter. Their presence gave them the manpower and firepower to remove the enemy before they did even more damage. "They'll be making their last stand up there," Lacey said. Once Dusty finished with the bandage on her shoulder, she picked up the rifle. "What are you planning on doing with that?" Tommy asked. "Mom, you can't fight," Dusty answered. "Yes, I can," Lacey replied. Dusty's bandage and care had restored some mobility to her left arm, and she was able to carry the weapon with both hands. Neither Tommy nor Dusty chose to say anything more about it. Both knew better than to try to get her to do something against her will. She was far too stubborn. "How many more are up there?" Tommy asked. "I took out 4, Lacey answered. "So I think there are around 8 left. But you can bet they'll use heavy artillery to keep us back while they finish their job." "Do you know if they've hooked up the satellite yet?" Dusty asked. Lacey shook her head. "Last I saw, they had some trouble getting the machine to work. I think we still have time to stop them. But there's more. They have some kids up there with them. They look like they could be college students." "They must be from the engineering lab," Dusty said. "I saw them being escorted into the trucks when I left campus. The terrorists might be forcing them to work on the satellite uplink." "All right," Tommy said, turning to the crowd. "Our best chances are splitting up and surrounding them. We do our best to prevent any collateral damage. Is there another way up to the Overlook?" Deputy Milton asked. "There is," Lacey answered. "Okay, half of you follow Lacey," Tommy said. "The other half follow me up the trail." Lacey didn't think Tommy understood what he was about to do, and the dangers of going up the trail. "They'll be expecting you," Lacey said. "And they're going to throw everything they've got at you." "Which is why you need to get up there quick and help us out," Tommy said. Lacey had never believed Tommy was a coward, but she feared he was biting off more than he could chew. However, the longer they argued about who was supposed to do what, the less time they had to stop those terrorists before they destroyed more innocent lives. "Dusty, you're with me," Lacey said, and before her son could object, she shot him a look that piped him down. "Be careful," Tommy said. "You too," Lacey replied. "And give us 5 minutes before you start back up the trail. Our path will take us a little longer." "Right," Tommy said. Lacey led Dusty and the locals back down the trail to the turnoff and headed up to the steep incline. Everyone was quiet on their trek over the rough terrain. Part of it was because of the strenuous hike, but the other aspect was fear. These locals weren't soldiers, but they were prepared to defend their homes against these violent monsters. Lacey understood that not all of them, including herself, would survive. "I want you to stay close to me when we start fighting," Lacey said, looking at her son. "Mom, I can handle myself," Dusty said. "I know you can," Lacey said. "But I would feel better if you stayed close. Watch my back, you know?" "Oh," Dusty said. "Yeah, okay." Lacey hoped that framing herself as someone who needed the help would make her son listen to her more. And she was glad it had worked. Not that she couldn't use the backup. She might have been putting on a show of good sport, but she was tired and in pain. All Lacey wanted to do was quit. But she couldn't, not with so much at stake, so she gritted her teeth and pushed through it.
"What is the holdup?"
Jenkins paced angrily near the computer, unraveling what little razor-thin patience he had. The college student had taken longer than Jenkins had anticipated. "I'm going as fast as I can," he said, "but I'm practically doing this from memory, and the sequences are a lot more complicated than—"
"I don't care,"
Jenkins roared.
"If those missiles aren't synced up with the satellite in the next 5 minutes, then I'm going to shoot one of your friends every minute that you're late."
The boy almost broke down, but he continued to work. Jenkins planned on killing all of them anyway when this was through. They were useless. Pathetic and useless.
"Sir,"
a fighter cried out, sucking wind as he rushed over to Jenkins.
"The townspeople are coming up from the trail, and they're armed." "And what do you have, a paintball gun?"
Jenkins asked.
"Get into a defensive position and take them out."
The fighter quickly retreated and gathered their remaining men. Everything was falling apart. Jenkins had chosen Big Rock because it was a small town. Easy for them to secure and take control, but it had proven to be anything but easy. The town had resisted more than Jenkins had anticipated, but they could not lose control of this mountain. The altitude was integral to establishing a connection with the satellite. Jenkins had tried to find a more powerful computer, but this was the best they could get under the circumstances. The altitude was to make it easier to establish a clean connection and make it harder for any military personnel to hack their signal. The EMP might have taken out large swaths of civilian infrastructure, but Jenkins doubted the military was rendered completely neutralized. They would have protocols for such an event. And the longer Jenkins took to complete his mission, the more time he gave to the military to find him.
"Clock's ticking, kid,"
Jenkins said, and he removed the pistol, ready to spill blood. It was a steep hike to the peak, but when they finally neared the edge, Lacey slowed and gestured for everyone to stay low and quiet. She slowly poked her head over the top and saw the surviving terrorists already prepared to make their final stand. All of them had their guns aimed at the trail. The moment Tommy and the others showed up, they were going to be met with a wall of bullets that would kill half of them instantly. If they were going to survive, Lacey and the others needed to strike first, and they needed to do it quickly. Lacey ducked back down and turned toward the others who had followed her. "We need to move quickly over the top here. The moment we step over this rock, though, they'll see us. We have to start firing at them immediately. Our advantage is that we're on the high ground. You stay low, and we should avoid most of their gunfire." "Most?" one of the locals said. "So you're saying some of us will get hit?" Lacey didn't want to sugarcoat the situation for them. "Yes." The group exchanged worried glances with one another, and it was obvious that their resolve was weakening. But Lacey needed them to be strong. She needed them to be prepared to face off against an enemy hell-bent on victory. "They came here and killed people," Lacey said. "Friends and family, and they're going to keep killing until we stop them. No one else is going to do this job. We have to. And while it might not be our responsibility, We have a chance to prevent others from dying. That's what we're doing now. Hold on to the thought that you're keeping your family safe. You're keeping this town alive. Lacey had never been one for motivational speeches, and she wasn't sure if her words would affect these people, especially considering her personal history with them, but one of them joined her.
"She's right," he said. "This is our job now. It's dangerous, but the cost of doing nothing is far worse."
They all nodded, and Lacey was glad to see their resolve return.
"Okay, on my mark,"
Lacey said, and everyone readied themselves. Lacey and Dusty were the first ones over the ledge, keeping low on a crawl toward the other side where they would have a better shot at the enemy. The others weren't far behind, the cluster of them moving as fast as possible toward the ridgeline that had a view of the terrorists' location. Lacey was the first one to line up her sights. The pain in her shoulder was excruciating, but she pushed through it, knowing everyone was needed to end this fight. Lacey waited until the others were in position in her peripheral, and then, just when she squeezed the trigger, the first terrorist noticed them on the ridgeline. Lacey's group fired first, causing terrorists to retreat behind cover momentarily, before they regrouped and aimed at the ridge. The first round of gunfire exchange didn't offer any casualties, but Lacey winged one of the enemies. No one was hit on their side. But when the second, third, and fourth rounds of gunfire were returned, a few of their people were shot.
"Get the wounded back,"
Lacey shouted.
"If you can't shoot, then get back."
Only 2 wounded rolled away from the ridge, while the rest kept pressing on the enemy. Every gunshot and recoil of the rifle into her shoulder triggered a fresh round of pain. But they were so close to getting them to run. All that mattered now was finishing them off. When Lacey didn't think they would make it, Tommy and the others appeared on the trail and opened fire. The terrorists were split in 2. Unable to concentrate all their firepower on one group, and the divide-and-conquer approach paid off. One by one, the terrorists fell amid screams of pain and cries of fear. Lacey, Dusty, Tommy, and all the locals battled to bring the enemy down until there were only a handful of them. But the surviving terrorists had gathered the students they had and used them as a human shield, forcing Tommy and the others to hold their fire.
"Put down your weapons, or I will start shooting these kids."
It was the giant that Lacey had spotted earlier, and he had a gun to the head of the kid who had been working at the computer console. Lacey was betting the student had been trying to establish the link. Whether he had succeeded yet was unknown, but the missiles hadn't launched, so Lacey took that as a good sign.
"I'm not bluffing,"
the giant shouted. The fact that the terrorists had those young men and women in their grasp made everyone consider the demand. No one wanted innocent blood on their hands, except for the brute with the gun.
"Mom, we need to stop him,"
Dusty said.
"I know,"
Lacey said. She racked her brain, and she came up with an idea.
"You see that point up there?"
Lacey gestured to a nearby high point, and Dusty nodded.
"Go up there and take the shot to bring him down,"
Lacey answered. Dusty stood there, gawking at his mother.
"But you're the better shooter."
"Yeah, but I can't get up there in my condition," Lacey said.
"And you are a good shot. You just need confidence. You can do this, son."
Lacey handed Dusty the rifle, knowing he was more than capable of ending this standoff.
"You take out the big guy, and the others will drop like flies," Lacey said.
"How do you know?" Dusty asked.
"Because that's what animals do when their leader goes down," Lacey said.
Dusty nodded, and then started the climb up to the high point. At that angle, he would have a clear shot at the ogre, who was using a student as a human shield. It was a small window, but one Dusty was more than capable of hitting.
"Come on, son," Lacey said. "You can do this."
Lacey watched Dusty get into position and then peer into the scope. He steadied himself and put his finger on the trigger.
"Don't second-guess yourself," Lacey said. "You can do this."
Lacey glanced back down to the hostage situation, which was growing more tense as Tommy and the others refused to drop their weapons. Lacey had seen plenty of violent men throughout the years, and she didn't think the giant was bluffing about killing those students. There was already a dead girl on the rocks. "Dusty, do it," Lacey said, whispering to herself.
"Take the shot." "That's it," the giant screamed. "He dies."
The gunshot thundered through the open air, and at first, no one moved. Tommy held up his hands, making sure his team didn't shoot, and the terrorists all gawked in shock as their leader lay dead on the ground. And then, one by one, all the terrorists dropped their weapons, released the students, and put their hands in the air. Tommy and the others swooped in and made sure the scene was secure. Lacey glanced up at her son, proud he had been able to take the shot. When he came down to join her, he looked different. "You saved them, Dusty," Lacey said. "You saved a lot of people."
"It doesn't feel right,"
Dusty said. "It's not," Lacey replied. "But that man was a monster. He didn't give anyone a choice." Dusty nodded, a distant look in his eyes, but he handed the gun back to his mother and glanced down at Tommy and the others. "Something's wrong," Dusty said, frowning. Lacey saw Tommy waving his hands, screaming for them to come down. The pair navigated a narrow ledge to the Overlook, joining Tommy and the others around the machine.
"I don't know what's happening. It says the target is locked and the countdown has started,"
Tommy said, gesturing to the screen.
"Shoot it,"
Milton said. "No!" The student who had been held hostage by the now-deceased terrorist leader jumped forward. "You destroy it, and it'll only set off the rest of the missiles. The targets are already synced. The only way to stop it now is to enter the cancel sequence."
"I have your professor's book,"
Dusty said, quickly handing the journal to the student.
"Can you stop it, Justin?"
I think so." Justin turned toward the machine, stepping over the dead terrorist, and started typing in the coded sequence to shut off the targeting system. His face was red and sweaty, but he was determined to finish.
"We need to hurry this up, kid,"
Milton said.
"Stand aside. I'm gonna shoot it."
"No, I can do this. Just give me a second." One of the missiles on the weapon system thrust and rocketed into the sky. They watched as the missile soared through the air, and Lacey thought it was over. "I can still stop it," Justin said. He quickly typed in the code, and everyone watched him and then the missile going farther and farther away.
"Justin?"
Dusty said, watching the missile as it started to vanish from sight. "Done," Justin said, and he pushed the enter key. Everyone glanced to the sky, holding their breath, and then exhaled as the missile's trajectory died, and it fell into the woods, landing harmlessly in the mountains.